I remember waking up to the sound of something wet, not the dripping of water. Mine, you know. It was more like the slow, slurping drag of a pig's snout as it rooted just under my wooden bed frame. I had long since grown used to it. Of course, in the house, the pigs came and went as they pleased. There were no separate quarters for animals, and certainly no space for privacy. I rubbed my eyes and blinked toward the hole in the thatch above, where early morning light filtered through and flickered over the straw-packed walls. The smell. Oh, it hit the moment I moved the blanket wool, scratchy and damp as always. The chamber pot had not been emptied last night. It sat, full and somehow steaming, beside the sleeping form of my brother, who had one foot still wedged in last night's cabbage broth. I shifted, trying not to knock over the bread crusts that served as our pillow stuffing. I could already hear father coughing up something that sounded more solid than air. That meant he was awake and likely angry about something, probably the rats again. He always took it personally when the rats got into his barley cakes. Outside, I could hear the high-pitched squeal of the neighbor's goat. Or maybe it was her husband. One of them was being milked. I assumed the air was thick with the kind of chill that doesn't sting so much as settle into your bones. Like a poorly timed guest. My tunic, crusted at the hem with something I hoped was yesterday's soup, was folded neatly beside me. Folded means heaped into a vague triangle of sadness. I dressed slowly, feeling each fiber of coarse linen scratch across my skin. There was a raw spot on my thigh from where the stitching had unraveled and rubbed through the night. A spider, an impressively large one, watched me from the rafter. We didn't name them anymore. They never stayed long. Breakfast was a bowl of something I had not asked questions about. It jiggled. It smelled like wet bark and regret. Mother called it pottage, which seemed generous. My teeth ached as I chewed, and a small pebble shifted loose from the mixture, which I placed on the table for safekeeping. You never knew when you'd need a good pebble. My youngest sister chased a flea across her belly while humming something that sounded like a death chant. No one stopped her. We had stopped doing things like that. After all, it was Monday, or maybe Wednesday. The days blurred, like the lines between meals and misfortunes. I stepped outside and immediately sank, ankle-deep, into mood. The village was less a collection of homes and more a scattering of leaning sheds tied together by puddles and shared diseases. I waved to the baker's boy, whose nose had been bleeding since last Thursday. He seemed cheerful enough. Behind him, a cart tipped sideways into the gutter, its load of cabbage rolling like defeated soldiers into the mud. A rooster hopped onto one, looked around as if it owned the place, and promptly fell asleep. That's how mornings went. Mostly. Slow, damp, and filled with things you tried not to name. I tried to stretch, but the stiffness in my joints made that decision for me. My body creaked like the beams of our roof, and I suspected we might both collapse in the same week. I made my way toward the well, though calling it that was a kindness. It was more of a shared mud pit with aspirations. The bucket was missing again, and someone had tried to replace it with what looked like half a shoe. A line of neighbors stood ahead of me, arms crossed, eyes half open, swaying slightly like sleepy scarecrows. I recognized them by smell more than sight told. Gervais, with the fermented turnip scent. Edith, whose cloak carried the persistent bouquet of wet feathers and sheep breath. And of course, tiny Oswin, who I believe had not bathed since the comet. No one spoke. There wasn't much left to say anymore. We simply nodded, each nod meaning, yes, we are still alive, and yes, we regret it. By the time I reached the front, the water was thick, not muddy thick. I stirred it with a stick. Something blinked and vanished. I filled my cracked jug anyway. There was washing to be done. Back at the house, my mother was elbow deep in what she claimed was laundry, though it resembled a slow battle between rags and pond scum. She handed me a tunic to scrub, and I dipped it into the barrel of lukewarm disappointment. The soap was made from ashes and lard and smelled like scorched sadness. I scrubbed until the fabric gave up a few layers of grime. revealing what may have once been blue, or grey, or skin. My sister hung close nearby, humming a tune that had only 3 notes, but managed to sound like all 7 in distress. Our neighbor's rooster screamed again. It had opinions about everything. Once the tunics were as clean as they'd ever been, meaning marginally less stiff-eye. Hung them beside the pig pen and stepped back, just in time to watch one fall directly into pig waste. No one was surprised. My brother tried to fish it out with a rake, then gave up and buried it like a fallen soldier. By midday, the sky had turned a color I called boiled goose, gray-yellow, vaguely threatening. Lunch was a slice of rye bread so hard we had to soak it in onion broth until it wept. My teeth thanked me, but barely. The broth was bitter and made from onion, peels and water that had once been near an onion. Mother added a handful of dried something to it. Might have been herbs, or leaves, or accidentally swept in floor bits. We called it seasoning and chose not to question it. My father, ever the philosopher, declared the meal better than famine, which was his standard blessing. I nodded along, chewing slowly, thoughtfully, as one might a damp scroll. Across the road, I saw a man fall off his cart while trying to swat at a duck. The duck looked pleased. Someone clapped. That was the most excitement we'd had all week. I returned to my chores, primarily standing in fields and pretending to inspect things. The wind carried the distinct aroma of sheep, turnip, gas, and something rotting. Probably us. The village bell rang once. Not for any reason, just out of habit. It made us all pause, sigh, and return to our lives. I picked up a shovel, not because I needed to, but because holding something made it feel like I had purpose. The dirt was as dry as gossip, and twice as hard. I poked it once, then sat on it instead. By late afternoon, I had developed a cough. Nothing dramatic, just a slow, wet rattle in the chest that came and went like an uninvited uncle. My mother said it was the damp air again, though I suspected it was the mold on the ceiling that now had mushrooms growing from it. I stepped back indoors for tea, or what we call tea, a cup of hot water with a single wilted leaf floating in it, trembling like it had regrets. The cup was made of clay and had a chip shaped like whales. I drank slowly, pausing every few sips to pick out bits of floating ash or insect wing. My sister joined me, cradling a lump of stale cheese as if it were a pet. She asked if she could lick the salt rock again later. We all took turns with a Tower family heirloom. As the sun slipped behind the thatched rooftops, a gloom settled over the village. Not night, just heavier, grey. I walked toward the latrine with purpose, which is the only way one should approach it. It was shared by 5 families and was, if I'm honest, more whole than structure. The walls leaned inward as if ashamed. The smell, however, was ambitious. I entered and immediately regretted every step of my life. A spider web brushed my face, and something warm squished underfoot. I did not investigate. One mustn't ask questions in the latrine. I breathed through my mouth and tried not to taste the air. Someone had attempted to hang dried lavender nearby, but it only made the place smell like floral despair. Outside, a chicken pecked at the mud near the door and watched me with something between judgment and pity. I gave it a curt nod. Back at the house, the fire had been lit not for warmth, but to smoke out the fleas. We all took turns sitting near the smoke, coughing politely. My brother combed through his shirt with a blunt fork, fishing out tiny bugs and placing them on a napkin like trophies. My father muttered something about back in his day, though we were fairly certain this was still his day. Supper was a mystery pie. We called it that because asking about the ingredients ruined the illusion. It had a crust, which was hopeful, and something inside that jiggled when disturbed. I cut into it and found what might have been a feather. My mother smiled gently and said, "Protein." I chewed carefully, wincing every time something crunched that shouldn't. We ate in silence, each of us imagining a better meal, or perhaps no meal at all. Sometimes hunger was easier than guessing. Outside, someone was shouting about a missing sheep. Again, no one moved. The sheep were always missing. Some said they had a secret village where they lived free and clean. I hoped it was true. My sister fell asleep on the floor mid-soup. We left her there. It was warmest by the hearth, and besides, she'd earned it. A pot hissed on the coals, bubbling quietly, possibly fermenting. The room smelled of sweat, smoke, and stew. I stared at the ceiling and watched the mushrooms pulse gently in the breeze. Life, I thought, was a long and patient illness. Night came. Not suddenly, but as a slow thickening of the air. The kind of darkness that didn't feel like the absence of light, so much as the presence of something heavier. We didn't light candles often. They were made from animal fat and gave off a smell that clung to your soul. Instead, we sat in the dark and let our eyes adjust, which usually meant staring vaguely in the direction of voices and assuming who was speaking, based on tone and sigh patterns. My father played a stringed instrument he had made himself out of a bent plank and horsehairs. It had 4 notes, all of them mournful. We listened politely. A beetle crawled across my foot, and I didn't move. It was too late in the day to start a war. The fire had died down to red whispers, and the smoke lingered like a tired ghost, wrapping around our hair and settling into every fold of clothing. My sister began snoring, in small squeaks like a broken kettle. Somewhere outside, an owl coughed. I rolled out my bedding, which was mostly a sack of straw and old tunic sleeves, and tried to find a side that was least damp. I succeeded. Slightly. I lay on my back, staring upward into the dark, listening to the rhythmic drip of condensation from the thatch above. It hit my forehead every few minutes. It had a schedule. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and felt something small move underneath it. I chose not to know what it was. There were too many possible answers, and none of them would help me sleep. As I drifted towards slumber, I thought about tomorrow. Market day. A chance to walk for hours, stand in a square surrounded by shouting men, smell a variety of meats that defied species, and perhaps trade a turnip for a rag or a rock. My mother always told me to dress nicely on market day. I had one nice tunic, which meant it had fewer holes and slightly less smell. I made a mental note to brush it off with a twig in the morning. Outside, I heard the wind moving through the trees like it had lost something. A distant dog barked once and was told to stop by a louder bark. Silence returned, heavy and complete. I shifted slightly, and the straw crunched beneath me like old bones. I closed my eyes and tried to think of something warm, maybe soup, or a fire. Or that one time 3 years ago when my feet were dry for a whole afternoon. Sleep pulled at me, soft but insistent, like a cat kneading your chest. And then, just before my mind fully faded, I heard the unmistakable plop of the chamber pot tipping over. No one screamed. We just let it happen. It was too late for regrets. Besides, it would dry eventually. Everything did, in time. Morning returned, not with grace, but like a damp sack dropped on your head. I woke to the sound of someone retching outside and the familiar slap of bare feet on wet earth. My eyes blinked open to find my brother, already dressed, or rather, wrapped in what passed for clothes. He was attempting to scrape dried soup from his sleeve with a stick, humming something off-key and vaguely threatening. I rose carefully, checking my blanket for creatures before swinging my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold and sticky. I didn't ask why. I didn't want to know what I was sticking to. Our family had already begun the ritual of breakfast. This morning it was gruel grey and resentful, simmered to a consistency best described as suspicious. My spoon bent slightly when I dipped it in. It trembled, not unlike my faith. I sat cross-legged on the floor as we passed around the salt rock, taking reverent licks like monks with a relic. My father recited something he called a blessing, but it mostly involved listing which relatives had died of bowel ailments. It made the gruel seem less offensive by comparison. After breakfast, I helped mother patch the roof. This involved climbing onto the rafters, stuffing straw into holes, and pretending the wind wasn't trying to kill me. I tied the new thatch with twine made from goat hair and size. It held, for now. A bird flew out from the eaves, with a rat in its mouth, and stared at me like I owed it money. I nodded and climbed back down. My reward was a small boiled onion and half a turnip. I ate both slowly, savoring the texture of disappointment. Midday brought a visit from the reeve, the village official, responsible for reminding us we were poor in new and exciting ways. He asked whether we'd paid our taxes in grain, to which my father replied by vomiting slightly into a bucket. The reeve took that as a no, and left a warning nailed to our door. A picture of a crying chicken, which I believe meant last chance. We nodded in solemn acceptance. We'd had worse. Once, they left a drawing of a pig on fire. That had been a bad winter. Later, I walked to the edge of the village where the compost heap steamed gently in the sun. I sat on a log and watched the insects perform their ballet of decay. A child wandered past, wearing shoes made from mismatched leather and dried leaves, dragging a stick that seemed to serve no purpose except emotional support. He didn't speak, just nodded, as if to say, yes. This is life. I returned home in time to see my brother catch a frog in his hat and declare it our dinner. No one objected. Protein was protein. My mother boiled it with herbs she claimed were sage, but smelled like damp lettuce. We chewed in silence as rain began to fall through the parts of the roof we had forgotten to patch. My sister held a bowl under the drip and called it a blessing. I wasn't sure if she meant the water or the noise. Either way, we all agreed, in that subtle, exhausted way peasants do. This day had been mostly tolerable. That night, I didn't so much fall asleep as surrender to it. I lay on my back, fingers laced across my chest, like a mildly offended ghost, and stared into the beams above. The mushrooms were gone. Something had eaten them, or perhaps they had moved on to a better roof. Either way, their absence left a sort of emptiness, as if the ceiling itself had exhaled. Outside, the wind made the same noise it always made, like an old woman, muttering about past mistakes. The fire was out, the pot was cold, and the room smelled of wool, onions, and resignation. I could hear my brother scratching somewhere across the floor in the soft, rhythmic gurgle of my father breathing through one nostril. The dog, who was not ours but lived with us anyway, let out a long whine and rolled over on someone's foot. No one flinched. That was the rhythm of night sound. Without meaning, movement without energy, I thought about tomorrow. The week would start again. If it hadn't already, tasks would rotate, stirring, scraping, hanging, patching, carrying, and occasionally collapsing. My tunic, still damp from the drip, had grown stiff in the corner like an angry ghost. I would wear it anyway. The chamber pot had been righted, miraculously, though we all suspected the dog had drunk from it. My sister mumbled something in her sleep, probably about frogs. We'd had too much of them lately. As my eyelids drooped, I thought about hope. Not the real kind. Of course, just the small version. Like hoping the bread tomorrow would be less chewy, or that the fleas might go easy on the ankles. I remembered once, years ago, I had seen a candle that didn't smell. It had belonged to a traveling friar, who claimed it was made of beeswax and heavenly light. I hadn't believed him, but I had never forgotten the way the flame flickered without wincing. That image came to me now, warm and impossible, as I sank further into my itchy straw and faded thoughts. Sleep came at last, not gently, but thoroughly. It settled over the room like a quilt stitched from exhaustion, stretched across every creaking joint and unspoken sorrow. We snored, we itched, we dreamt of stew, and somewhere far away, in some slightly less miserable place, the sheep dreamed too.